Thank you for coming, and it's a rainy night and it was hard to get here. Before I introduce our speaker, George Freeman, this is the second in a series of seminars in the BII lecture series called Privacy Issues in Genomic Medicine. BII, of course, is the Balliol Interdisciplinary Institute, and the series is in collaboration with the OII. And I'm Bill Dutton. I'm a professor of Internet Studies at the OII, and I have been trying to help Arthur Thomas, and other people in the room have also been associated with Arthur Thomas, who proposed a series on this topic. We're very lucky to have George Freeman, Member of Parliament for the Mid-Norfolk region of the UK, and he was a graduate of Radley College and Girton College in Cambridge in 1989. He then spent, I think, 15 years in the biosciences around Cambridge as in venture capital. So right away, we know we have a future-oriented person who's business-minded, but he's also very astute in public affairs, and he was elected to Parliament in 2010, and a couple of years after his election, he was appointed by the Prime Minister to be the life science advisor for the government. And he's been working with David Willits, who is the Minister for the Universities and Science. He was reappointed to that office, and he has also been involved in developing the government's life science strategy. So it's a perfect match for the seminar series, and he's going to talk about genetics and patient empowerment, the new frontier for medicine, and I think that he's asked that this be an informal and conversational meeting, and I appreciate you coming, and thank you for offering to make this a discussion. Thank you.
Well, Bill, thank you very much. Are you happy if I stay seated as part of the conversational format? And it's a real pleasure to be here for lots of reasons, partly to be able to have a conversation with eminent people who are thinking through a number of these issues. So I'm really keen to, perhaps if I could set out some introductory thoughts, but please feel free to interrupt while I'm doing that, if there's anything that you wanted to pick up or challenge or query or clarify. And I will finish with some questions, very genuinely, because I think there are some really important questions that need to be answered, which I don't have the answers to, but I come bearing the questions. And I genuinely, hugely welcome the opportunity to share it with you. I suppose the first thing to say is thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity to get out of Parliament and come and talk in one of the world's great universities about what I think is one of the world's greatest and most exciting revolutions, for reasons I'll say a little bit more about. At a time when this country is having to think very profoundly about what our business model as a nation is, to use a venture capital term, how we get out of this debt crisis, how we build and lay the foundations for a truly different model of growth, a sustainable model of growth. My contention is that our universities are absolute jewels in the crown, not just as centres of research, which of course Oxford, Cambridge and others are famously, but as, even more importantly probably, as centres of well-informed inquiry, centres of rational inquiry and debate, and actually at a time when the world's confronted by a lot of very challenging and very fast-moving revolutions that are quite disorientating, the ability to come together and talk rationally about what these challenges mean and what opportunities they create, I think is hugely valuable. And I think our universities have got a much bigger part to play in this country's future in all levels, and certainly in policy making. So I wish there was a faster railway line from London to Oxford. I wish there was a fast railway line from Oxford to Cambridge. I'm working on that with David Willits and the Chancellor, who I was with this afternoon. And I think linking our great cities, great universities up better actually is part of driving both an economic recovery, but also a conversation about this nation and where it fits in this rapidly globalizing world, and how we apply our science and our research. So that's the first point. Second is, I work very closely with John Bell, Regis Professor here in medicine, who's a life science advisor with me. I'm seeing him in the morning, going to look around the Radcliffe and some of the latest biomedical research. And Arthur and I first hooked up several years ago, and I was really delighted when you contacted me. So it's a genuine pleasure to be here. And I don't think there is enough interaction between Oxford and Cambridge, so as a self-professed Cambridge man, it's particularly good to be here. It's also, I think, really important what you're doing, which is an interdisciplinary project within the college, and the internet studies within the university. I'm not actually a proper card-carrying scientist. I've been in the commercialisation of science. I have a biology A-level. I don't have a PhD in molecular biology. And so I've sort of come to science and lived through it as a lay admirer, advocate and champion and investor of what science can do. And one of the things I've observed in that role, both as a VC, as a company founder and manager, and then as an advisor in private sector and in government, is the importance of multidisciplinary work, actually, in creating new opportunities. I might also add the importance of accidentalism. For all the strategies, for all the grant applications, for all the attempt to define, justify, rationalise, predict the outcomes of academic research, certainly in biomedicine, I would contend without the evidence right at my fingertips that the majority of the most important breakthroughs in the 20th century have come through things that could not have been predicted at the time the team involved would have put their grant application in. They came through often accidental discoveries from an inquiring mind or set of minds, and or through multidisciplinary interactions, people observing a colleague's work and remarking on what it might signify, the way they look at it. And actually that's an important point. I think we've siloed an awful lot of our research, certainly in biomedicine, and I think we've siloed a lot of the conversation. And I think one of the things that's going on at the moment is the breakdown of those silos, and it's all to the good, I think, that you're doing this. So it's a pleasure to be here for that reason too. I thought it'd be helpful just to say something about perhaps where I'm coming from, both a little bit of the experiences that I've brought to the work I'm doing, something about the work I've been doing in government and the work that government is trying to do, because I think that sets the scene for the comments I'll make about genomic medicine. And it also flags, I think, some of the challenges and frames some of the questions that it's worth thinking about. And then some specific thoughts about the use of genomic and patient data in modern biomedical research, and specifically some of the very real policy issues that I think sit on the government's desk, which we ought to be perhaps thinking about for the rest of the evening and beyond. So Bill, you've been kind enough to describe my career briefly. I was in venture capital for 4 years in the 90s, and then left and ran a startup for 4 years, saw it through to acquisition, and then I set up a Cambridge-based translational medicine consulting and corporate finance business. And I suppose I was, and have been described as a very early advocate of what's known as translational medicine in biomedicine, which is really a complicated and ugly word for a beautiful thing, which is the reorientation of biomedical research around patients, and the breakdown of a very siloed model of medical innovation, which has really predominated in the last 20, 30, 40 years, which is sort of university research over there, boffins in labs, which if you're lucky might then get commercialized into some vehicle or licensed across to industry, and then gets put through commercial discovery, and then if it's lucky goes over the wall, literally, that's how they refer to it in pharma, into development, where it goes through a series of trials to prove efficacy, safety, and then eventually, if you're lucky, 15 years later and $1.5 billion, the drug is brought back to the NHS, to the government, and put through a very, very tough series of procurement hurdles. And if you're a patient waiting patiently at the end of the chain for a medical innovation, what very often happens is that the innovation never gets to you because it fails in trials, and or becomes too expensive for the company to carry the cost, and or the government can't afford to pay the price required to justify that 15-year development cost, and or in phase 3 or 4 trials, it's discovered that the bell curve of impact on the patient population illustrates that it has very serious side effects, negative side effects on a very small group of patients, and for that reason is canned. And that dilemma, the length of time it takes to develop, this is particularly true for drugs, but it's also to a lesser extent true for devices and diagnostics. That essential challenge has driven the industry into a crisis of sustainability. The pharmaceutical industry has effectively dealt with that crisis for 15 years by buying each other out, and a very clear pattern of consolidation and globalization, so reducing the overhead costs, globalizing the sales operation, and investing hugely into the technologies of tomorrow. But that actually hasn't disguised or even dealt with the underlying crisis in their pipeline. And the translational medicine narrative explains this really with reference to the siloization and the separation of patients from the process, and accounts for this failure by the fact that actually if you develop drugs absent real living patients, particularly ones with the disease, and then bring it back to them at the end of the process, don't be surprised if 8 or 9 times out of 10 the thing you've developed off the back of an academic theory around a naturally occurring pathway, metabolic pathway, doesn't actually prove to hold good in real diseased patients with real disease and diseased tissues and all the comorbidities and complexities that go with often complex disease syndromes. And the translational medicine approach says what we have to do is put patients right back at the heart of the discovery and development process. In fact, we need to bring university academics, industry researchers, clinicians in hospitals and government back together and create the spaces, the intellectual and physical spaces, where medical discovery and development is done with, through and around patients at their heart. So if I had a slide, it would have a triangle, and in the middle is the patient, and in the corner is industry, academic and clinical researchers. And translational medicine has sometimes been referred to as from bench to bedside, which sort of gives the idea of people stealing through the corridors in the dead of night with something from the lab to test on a patient. It isn't at all a lateral, one-way, linear process. It's a triangular, iterative and feedback process in which clinical, academic and industrial researchers work together around patients. And so that's what I mean by translational medicine. And I became an advocate of it really because I lost a lot of hair as a venture capitalist trying to start companies using the old model. And we were typically putting in £250,000 the morning after the dinner with the academic to form the company. We'd put 6 people on it, put together a business plan. In month 6, we'd put in £3 million. In month 18, we'd put in £6 million and try and float the company in 2 years. It was a very aggressive 1990s venture capital model. There are lots of things wrong with it. But one of the main things wrong with it was that there were very few patients or clinicians really in it. It was all about fund management, money into little companies, and a very long-term development pipeline. And essentially each person in the chain, the financing chain, was passing on the financing risk to the next person, ultimately with the hope that pharma would acquire it. What we discovered is actually pharma hasn't got a magic bullet. Unless you can design things with and around patients and deal with that fundamental problem of the time and the cost of development, we won't have a life sciences sector. So my advocacy of translational medicine came from experiencing the realities of venture capital and then running a company which was developing toxicology software and silicon chemistry. We were looking at the pharmacopoeia of compounds and asking ourselves, could we take the library of existing compounds and medicines that we know work, that are safe, work in patients, and rather than try and design ab initio, a new class of drugs, see whether we could understand and predict the side effect profiles of tweaking the chemistry of existing compounds. That would fast track us to an oral compound that would work better. And there have been a number of different companies set up to try and break this fundamental problem of the time cost of delivery. And this country has actually pioneered this model of patient-centered research. And the last government, the way I have approached this life science advisor role and the strategy is in a very strong spirit of cross-party long-term policy making, because I think unless there's a consensus, the last thing this sector needs is stop-start and sort of partisan policy making. And the last government did a huge amount of good here and set up the academic health science centres and the National Institute for Health Research. And in our elite centres of tertiary medicine, we've now got a number, sort of 10 to 30 centres where inspired clinical scientists who control patient resource in the hospital and academic resource in the university are doing personalised, patient-based research. I'll give you a number of examples, but they all involve increasingly genomics, and they involve understanding the genetics of disease and the genetics of predisposition to disease and the disease life cycles and how different patients respond to different diseases. Because the fundamental problem in that broken model is the more we discover about disease, the more we discover that what was yesterday one blockbuster drug is in fact, for one blockbuster disease, is in fact a number of different diseases. And the more we discover about genomics, the more we discover that we've all got it. We're just developing it in different ways according to partly genetic predisposition and coding and partly due to lifestyle factors. And actually genetic epidemiology is rapidly breaking down the markets. And what that means is that if you can work with patients early on, you can actually design the drug around the patient group who you know it will work with. That's extraordinarily exciting because that means we can then stop developing blockbuster drugs that claim to work for the entire bell curve of the population and design drugs or devices or diagnostics for a very specific cohort of the population who we know will respond to it, and we can then get the dosing right, we can then get the compliance right, we can dramatically reduce the cost of non-compliance, buying vast quantities of drug and giving it to everybody for a very small impact. So it actually is a very exciting revolution in the way we do medicine. And if you take, for example, Professor Simon Lovestone at the Institute of Psychiatry, I mention him not least because he's just been headhunted by Oxford. And Simon at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's has done some really pioneering work with the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust, 250,000 patients. He's collated all of the patient medical records, and in mental health, a huge cocktail of drugs over often many years. Put all that data in one place, created a database so that it can be interrogated in an anonymized way. In fact, my interaction with him started when he came to me and said, do you think industry might be interested in working with us? That's what you do, could you help us? And 3 months later, I came back to him with 12 pharmaceutical companies, all desperate to work with him, and he signed 6 in a pre-competitive consortium and signed 6 collaborations with the others. And with the NIHR's support, they've built a beautiful room and building with a beautiful database hub where you can interrogate in an anonymized way the data of 250,000 patients and see patterns of drug history, genomics, MRI, and begin to unpack the cohort and see, isn't that interesting that 90% of patients that presented with this and were treated with this went on to develop that or didn't respond to this. And that really begins to open up some really extraordinary opportunities for targeting medicines. And it's pretty exciting that he's coming here to Oxford and suggests that Oxford's doing something right. And my message really to government has been, look, of course it's challenging watching the pharmaceutical industry close down its old R&D plants, which were very much based on the old model of research over here, over the wall into development, phase 1, 2, 3, 4. And that will be painful, particularly for the localities concerned. But we shouldn't let that blind us to the opportunity of embracing the new model of patient-centred research and drug design and device design. And in fact, if we get it right, Britain has an extraordinary opportunity to lead this revolution globally. There is no other healthcare market in the world that has a 50-year record of patient record and drug disease clinical histories wrapped up in a nationalised system as the NHS. It's a phenomenal asset for us, and if we can develop the way to use it and apply it, we could really do some extraordinarily exciting things, both to actually help diffuse the degree to which the NHS is currently a major contributor to the structural deficit and will continue to drive up costs at the heart of the black hole in the public finances, but also, and alongside that, become a crucible for the innovation and a test bed for the innovations of tomorrow. So we become, if we get this right, the NHS can become genuinely a magnet globally for inward investment into these new targeted, stratified, ultimately personalised genomic medicines. And in so doing, that unlocks the potential to dramatically reduce the way we currently spend our procurement budget on buying what I would and have controversially at times described as the wrong drugs for the wrong people. So my argument to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor has been this is a huge agenda, actually, because it holds the possibility of making the NHS genuinely a driver of new and innovative treatments and makes Britain a home for these new technologies and these new therapies. Now, at the heart of that revolution, of course, sit patients. And what's very interesting about Simon Lovestone's study, and it's true of other centres around the country, is that far from patients being worried, concerned, alarmed or resistant to their data being used in research, patients actively embrace it, provided it's done in a way that is clinically led and that they can trust and understand and that they're involved in. There's some quite good empirical data, which I don't have at my fingertips, but when you ask patients, do you want your data to be used for research purposes? Not only do 99% of patients say, of course, they say, I thought it was at the moment. You mean it's not? You mean the NHS isn't using my anonymised data to help make sure that we prevent disease for the next generation? So I would contend that actually this revolution in patient data being used to drive next generation treatments and ultimately preventative therapies, if it's rooted in clinical structures and clinical leadership, I think there is a very high chance that we will carry public opinion with us. The fear, of course, is my data going to be given to some company? Now, of course, many companies are doing frontline research, but that's a distinction often in the public mind, that research good, companies bad, and we have to educate people that actually a lot of companies are taking vast risks to do research. But the joy of this translational approach is, of course, the research is being done by clinicians in hospitals and universities with industry as partners. But the evidence is that patients, when it's Professor Simon Lovestone, eminent clinician, leader, authority, academic, they trust, and rightly, they trust people like that. So I think there's a very exciting opportunity here for us to root this in and through clinical leadership. So a few words on what we've done in government and some of the issues around patient consent and data and genomics that's flushed out, and then a few thoughts on where the front line is now and some of the challenges. So we set out a very bold strategy in December 2011. It was launched by the Prime Minister. It's called the Life Sciences Strategy. I have a copy if anyone's interested. And the Prime Minister gave a big speech setting out what it was all about, which I can happily provide a copy with if you'd like. It's a 10-year strategy, and it essentially captures more or less what I've just described and says the vision for the UK in this field is every willing patient a research patient, and the NHS are not just an organisation for treating disease, but an organisation for using its own internal resources to unlock the insights that will allow us to prevent disease and personalise and target and stratify the way we treat, which in turn will unlock a whole new model of reimbursement and procurement. It was a bold speech, and it's a bold strategy, and it's 10 years because it won't happen overnight. The headline in the Telegraph the next day illustrates the challenge here, which was Tories to sell your data to pharma. And there were one or two, but literally one or two patient groups quoted as saying this was extremely worrying. But the many, many patient groups who were very supportive of the strategy and had contributed to it and were urging it on weren't given the airtime. And I think one of the challenges here is to change the politics of this so that there's a proper debate and a conversation, and those who are benefiting from this are able to be heard as well. But the life science strategy essentially says, look, we can't have a research cluster in the UK unless the NHS is pumping 2 cylinders in support, pumping in data, tissues, clinicians, patients to support this research, and on the upswing, adopting innovations more quickly. And then we set out a whole range of measures across from basic university research to translational research to industry to the NHS that's designed to facilitate that integrated healthcare economy. Specifically to the subject at hand tonight, we've launched, and 1 year on, December 12, the Prime Minister gave a second speech, and we've launched Genomics England, which is a £100 million programme to sequence the genomes of 100,000 patients and to combine that genome data with the phenotypic data from the hospital records to create a platform database, the first in the world, that will combine genetic and clinical data and provide essentially just a very, very much larger version of what Simon Lovestone was building at King's. There are a number of databases, data sets, longitudinal studies, cohort studies around the country, and one of the things we need to do is link them better. But this is an attempt to build a really core national database asset which can attract huge co-investment and collaboration from a whole range of academic and industrial collaborators and investigators, from companies that haven't even been started yet in Palo Alto to big pharma companies who are wanting to tackle this profound problem of productivity and targeting medicines better. So the contract for that sequencing has just been placed, and the work will be going on in the next 6 to 12 months. There's a company, a public company been set up called Genomics England, and there's a operating company that will be set up to go and bring in the co-investment. And our aim is to make Britain the global hub, home of genomic medicine. And I am chairing the advisory board for the operating company, and we're having to look around the world and try and get the balance right between being so prescriptive about this database that we back the wrong technology and lock out inventions and companies and collaborations and approaches that haven't even been thought of, and the risk of not defining it clearly enough and allowing it to be shaped by whoever happens to come along. And we need to make sure we've got a core database in which the NHS and patients and the Department of Health and the government, with its duty to patients, can be absolutely certain is robust and ethically managed, and patients' data is properly and confidentially looked after with all those protections. But the anonymised data set is made available in such a way as, with Simon Lovestone's case study at King's, it attracts co-investment that drives medical innovation and discoveries. And then our challenge will be to plug that into the NHS procurement mechanism so that you can come to Britain with a innovation that you want to target and design around patients, develop it here in silico, as it were, and then test it here, get into the NHS, work with patients and clinicians, prove it. And of course that opens up an extraordinary opportunity to change the reimbursement model. So instead of companies coming to us after 15 years and saying, we've spent $1.5 billion developing this, you're going to have to pay us top dollar, we say to companies, well, hang on a minute, we're investing £1 billion a year in the National Institute for Health Research, and we've created this database, and we're opening up the NHS for you. How about a different model of reimbursement where you work with us, we do the health economics, we don't pay anything for the innovation for the first year or 2 or 3, and when we've established the health economics in real patients, in real hospitals with our clinicians, then we can have a conversation with you about reimbursement. So there's a whole downstream tail of activity that flows from this. So alongside the Genomics England initiative, we've launched a major health data project. There's a series of different bits to it. In brief, they are firstly the opening up of the NHS's longitudinal cohort studies, so that if you want to come and do a study in the UK, you can very easily access the historic studies that have been done, and you can very quickly launch new studies using existing data. Secondly, and possibly even more profoundly, we have opened up the data on health outcomes, the old HES health studies data, which industry for years has said to us, look, if we don't have any benchmark data on what you're currently achieving by way of outcomes and interventions, how can we possibly benchmark? And that is quite challenging because it, as you've seen in the newspapers in the last 6 to 9 months, it's opened up, it's shone the torch on all sorts of failures. But our view is this is part of changing the culture in modern healthcare. We want patients to start to shine the torch and start to ask questions about why are health outcomes in the north so much better than in the south in this area, and why in other areas is it different, and why would I go to that hospital, not this hospital? And we want really to unleash what I've called the patient insurgency, patients taking responsibility for their health outcomes and driving through the system and driving standards up across it. Now, of course, all of this is being introduced at the time when we're reorganising the NHS, which is quite difficult. So these reforms are bedding in. But the idea is that your local clinical commissioning group has choice about where you would go and get treated. Your academic health science centre, which is the tertiary centre of excellence, there were 5 in the country. We've now plugged them into patient catchments, made them responsible for driving best practice in their area, and there are 15 academic health science networks. And the idea is, say here in Oxfordshire, your local clinical commissioning group will start to see best practice being driven through the academic health science network, through the tertiary research work that's being done, which will become relevant to patients. But of course it also has the quite deliberate effect of plugging the academic health science centre into a much bigger patient catchment for trial recruitment, for data, and for tracking lifestyle studies, cohorts, so that we can start to plug that academic excellence into health outcomes within the actual patient catchment, driving in turn more local databases. So, in all of this, I think it follows from what I've said that patient data, both in its personalised and individualised form, your health record, which shows your treatment history, your disease history, your outcomes over time, collated into a data set, an anonymised data set that allows interrogators, academic or industry, to look at patterns and use that to drive insights that will aid discovery, is absolutely central to this whole vision. And so the electronic health record, the intention is that that becomes the kind of golden ticket, if you like, that will allow patients to plug in and contribute and understand and engage and provide the basis for mass patient engagement in building up the data sets. Now there's a range of issues here to do with the logistics of building the software platform and connecting for health, which I don't think tonight is really about. But they are being got over. The issue I wanted to talk about really tonight is patient consent for this revolution and what the legitimate concerns are, which is not to suggest that public concerns are illegitimate. All patient concerns are legitimate, whether or not they're founded on fact or fear. They're all legitimate and they all have to be dealt with. And I think there are some issues which are dealable with, and people like Professor Lovestone have dealt with them and others are dealing with them day to day. And then there are some issues which are appearing, which have not been dealt with and need to be thought through. So here are some thoughts. The first is actually a sort of philosophical and ethical question: who owns this data? And I think this is in many ways the most interesting of all, which we might explore in a moment. Because successive governmental initiatives from Europe and in Whitehall and elsewhere have started to create a structure which suggests that this data belongs to the government or belongs to governments or that belongs in some way to the collective, to the public realm. We've seen Europe recently draft some potentially pretty difficult and problematic legislation around European data protection. And it's really important that we come up with a structure for this that carries public trust and confidence, but is actually flexible enough to allow the many and some as yet unpredicted, unforeseen interactions that we're going to need to happen to happen. There is a view espoused brilliantly by Baroness O'Neill in the House of Lords that says actually we've got this completely wrong, and we're building a structure of jurisprudence around data protection that is just false, and we should return to a much more English common law taught tradition that it's your data, our data, and it's up to us to contract with whomsoever we choose to contract with, and that personal sovereignty is sovereign and everything else should be secondary to it. And I'm quite attracted to that idea for all sorts of reasons, and we might talk through some of them, but it seems to me that it sends a very powerful and reassuring message that nothing happens to this data unless you, the patient in this context, allow it to happen. And that immediately creates a very proper test of public trust and confidence. If you can't convince patients to tick the box, I'm happy for my data to be thus used, one could argue, well, you don't deserve to get access to the data. And that bit of me that is a conservative worries the idea of giving away to any large organisation unlimited exclusive access to all your data, particularly inadvertently. And the contractual element of I hereby allow my data to be used for X or Y, I think carries all sorts of benefits, not least the requirement for patients to engage in understanding what it might be used for and what might flow from it, and for the user of the data to account back to the providers of data for how it's been used and what they've done with it. So I think there's a really interesting question about the ownership of the data, which is not yet resolved. You may be interested to know I have a 10-minute rule bill in Parliament at the end of November, which makes provision for two things. Firstly, makes provision for electronic health records to be owned by the patient, and every patient to have their access to their own electronic health record and be encouraged to take ownership of it, both legal ownership and medical ownership in terms of taking responsibility for what's on it and checking that it's correct. And secondly, the bill makes provision for all healthcare professionals to maintain a patient's electronic health record properly and to ensure that it is passed on to the next person in their care pathway, so that the sort of sporadic use of electronic health records across different bits of the health service is integrated, and we begin to develop a culture of accountability as well as developing in that underlying asset. So I think there's a question about ownership of data. Then there's a question, I think, about use of data. And the evidence here, I think too much of it is anecdotal. One of the interesting things that I think we could do with is some more science on some more study, research into actually patient attitudes to this. There's a lot of anecdotal and sporadic and sort of accidental evidence, but I'm not sure there's yet a cohort of reliable data on this. But I think it's clear anecdotally and sporadically that patients basically are confident with the use of their data for research by clinicians and quite concerned about the use of data for commercial purposes by companies. Now, as I touched on earlier, I think that in itself is quite a crude but quite an accurate generalisation about public attitudes. Now, there's no doubt that there's a public education role to be done to explain how companies play an absolutely crucial role in research, and that this model of translational medicine, university, hospital and companies working together for the good of mankind is a good thing. But notwithstanding that, I think even within that there is a legitimate concern and argument that there is a difference between NHS health research for the good of mankind, even if it's done in conjunction with companies who are often a very, very, very long way away from having a commercial product, and research that's done for profit by companies in a very near market way. And there's then thirdly this question which you touched on, I noticed in your background notes, of the insurance fear, the fear that this information and data may well be used to compromise a patient's ability to get insurance, or to ultimately in all sorts of other ways to leak out and be used to ill effect. I'd perhaps say at this stage, I don't quite know, I think none of us do know quite how this is going to unfold, but I'm confident that we can add this fear to the list of great fears of the 20th and 21st centuries that didn't prove to be founded. The fear of the paperless office, the fear that the internet would kill books. There's a whole, so I'm now old enough to have remembered a number of these doom-laden prophecies that certain innovations would kill things that we cherish, and in fact the opposite has happened. And I'm confident actually that over time, actually we will find that we, the public, patients, actually care about our healthcare enough to embrace this revolution of patient empowerment. And in the same way that we, at first, when online banking came along, certainly some of us in the room were old enough to have remembered what a bizarre and alien concept that was. And I remember clicking on my first direct account for the first time and not really trusting that it was actually my balance, and sort of prodding the screen and wondering whether it was real. How could my money be real? How could I trust a virtual bank? And now, of course, none of us think twice about the difference between online or real banking. In fact, I suspect a lot of us, after the banking crisis, have got rather more faith in very simple online retail banking. And I think the same thing is going to happen in healthcare, and I think will be a good thing in healthcare if in, I think, 20 years, the next generation will all take it for granted that they have their electronic health records available, that they know what they look like, that they take an interest in them, and they expect the people who are giving them healthcare to use them and to draw on them, and can see the benefits of that, and they expect, I think it'll be very common for people to tick a box saying, I'm very happy for my electronic healthcare records to be used for research purposes done by clinicians through the NHS. And I think the public could easily get to a position where they're very happy if that research through the NHS is done in a way that unlocks revenues for the NHS. I think there's a way that this could be a huge win for Britain, for the NHS, and for British patients. But I think if we get it wrong, there is a danger that actually we lose public trust. And if, I think it's one of the things that we're all very seized by involved in Genomics England, if the 100,000 patient genome sequencing leads to an overly short-term, overly commercial, quick win for one or other company off the back of the collective data resource that we in the public sector invest in, I think we will undermine public support, which is why we're working hard to design a model that precisely does not fall into that trap, but actually shows that by pooling anonymized data and using it for research, we can drive the sort of benefits that I talked about earlier. And I think actually there's a wonderful opportunity here to put the NHS at the heart of this, and to use the NHS's very trusted brand to legitimise the collective endeavour in healthcare reform and the use of data in pursuit of that, in a way that works with the private sector as well. So I think at that point I will conclude and throw open a conversation and be fascinated to get your take on it. So I would summarise my contention, really, I suppose, by being this. We are living through the early stages of a profound revolution in the way biomedical research and very quickly healthcare and medicine will be done, which will be all about an increasing targeting, stratification, and ultimately personalisation of medicine, informed by our genetic, lifestyle, disease histories, and that the UK has an extraordinary opportunity to embrace that for the benefit of our economy and our health service and our patients. So I think this revolution is coming our way very fast. I think it has incredible benefits. And at the heart of it, if we get it right, I think we could quite quickly find large-scale public support for the use of electronic health records and patient data. But it requires this and the next government in the next few years to put in place some structures that give the public reassurance that we're doing it in the right way. And I think that ultimately that's about embedding it in clinical leadership. But ultimately it's about giving the patients the reassurance that it is their data and they can contract for its use and they can retract their permission in accordance with that contract, and that there is no big government, big company conspiracy to whittle their data out through the back door. This is about patients being empowered to participate in research. And I think if we root it in that, we will carry public support with us.
That's really a very compelling vision, and we're open to questions. But I guess my question would be whether or not, how do you make this transition to this model of patient ownership in a contractual way of their data to get there? We still are governed by data protection law, European data protection directives, and so forth. How do you make that transition, or is it holding things up now, or can things be done in the interim? How do we get to there without holding up progress along the lines that you've sketched?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a complex picture, really. On the one hand, there are professors, institutes, hospitals, clinics doing this very successfully at the moment, engaging patients, getting consent, getting trial clearance and authority and protocols. And there's some very good best practice in Britain that suggests that this can be done very well and very successfully. But you're absolutely right that there is a danger from Europe and closer to home, from Europe, that as the European Union seeks to put in place, harmonise a common market, as it were, for use of data and data protection provisions across the European Union, it inadvertently, or some might fear actually quite deliberately, makes this revolution that I've talked about very much harder, and rather shuts out the possibility of any corporate engagement in this revolution. So the direction of some of the thinking in the European Union on this, I think, is really alarming. And you may be interested to know, I'm just about to publish a major report through the Fresh Start group in Parliament on the extent to which the European Union is helping or hindering the UK life sciences. We look at food and medicine, agricultural science and research, and biomedical. And we've taken evidence from a large number of bodies, and I'll happily send you a copy of the report. So there's some difficulties, I think, in well-intentioned regulation trying to create a level playing field. And I know, even in just 3 years in Parliament, how well-intentioned legislation can create a whole series of inadvertent loopholes and barriers. And the danger in this sector is that we don't yet know how it's going to unfold. No one has yet sequenced 100,000 patient genomes and put them in a database. We don't know what that's going to look like. And we don't know what plugging that in with phenotypic data is going to make possible. It's quite difficult to legislate for what should be possible and impossible when we haven't even yet had the conversation about what it might enable. So it's going to require legislators, that's me, to keep very up to date with the breaking trends in the sector. That's the old me. And it's going to require Parliament to be very fleet of foot and much better informed, actually, with what's coming in order to carry public trust and confidence. So I think there's a legislative risk. I think the other big risk is that companies, the sector, has got to recognise that it has to carry public confidence as well. And I don't think in this context, in many ways, big pharma has necessarily been its own best friend. And one of the reasons I'm excited by the breakdown of markets and the stratification and the targeting and the personalisation is that you then embed the research in a much smaller cohort of patients who are very animated by the challenge of disease, and it makes the relationship much easier to mediate and broker and to build trust. If the government announced to the public that all industry is going to have access to all data, I think that is quite a difficult proposition to sell. But if you announce that we actively want to support UK Dementia Patients Association, working with Professor Simon Lovestone at King's to make available dementia patients' clinical records in an anonymised data set to drive a multi-million-pound research project to prevent dementia, that's rather easier to promote. So there's a whole range of challenges, I think, and they're sort of becoming clear, but they're not defined yet clearly, and that I think is what makes this a really challenging area to legislate in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And thank you very much for the very, very interesting presentation, which I find a very progressive set of initiatives which have some analogies, for example, with the Champernot Foundation, the Center for the Unknown in Portugal, where they're treating cancer patients, doing biomedical research, and linking with the broader public together in one facility, and actually calling for European cooperation with other partners. So some you might want to consider. And also in this country, in Northern Ireland, where I think Ministers Poots and Foster, Economy and Medicine, have called healthcare an opportunity, not just a sunken cost. But I want to return to the question of the data and the informed consent and ask a question. I think when you talk about the ownership of the data, this in fact has been supported at a quite high level in Europe. You may look to the Ilves report, where President Ilves of Estonia chaired a group, a task force on e-health task force, and they said, my data, my decisions, individuals are the owners and the controllers of their own health data, which was an analysis of the existing legislation. Though, and this is my question, I think as you very correctly said, the empirical studies show that in principle, whether we're talking here, whether we're talking in the United States, something about 99% of patients, when asked, are ready to donate their data, if asked, for medical research done by state institutes, by the clinicians. It gets more complicated with the companies. And this is, I think, very interesting what's going on in Europe now. And I want to ask you about the challenge in Brussels, particularly with the data protection regulation, which is now in the Parliament and the Council, that you have very strong lobbying by companies and by public research organizations that do not want to ask the citizens because they don't want to go ahead and make the case. And they do have a more difficult problem. And you see this, just my last words, with the health apps, where the Financial Times revealed that the top 9 in an anonymized form, but we're selling the data to insurance companies with really no transparency to the people using these apps. So my question is, do you think that going forward we can even go in the UK and in Europe beyond anonymized data, but get data that patients are willing to donate for research, but to be able to make the case that the industrial partners are also ready to use this data, but they need to win the trust of the patients? And then finally, would you be willing to then collaborate with other organizations in Europe, like the aforementioned Champernot Foundation, others?
Yes, I think that's yes, yes, and yes. Let me just try and take them in turn. So, the European question. I touched on the risk that I think is becoming very clear, that the European Union is in danger of creating a structure which actually mitigates against this revolution rather than supports it, which would be, I think, a disaster and B, quite unnecessary. Actually, the report I mentioned, the Fresh Start report, is very critical of Europe on agricultural research. I think we talk about condemning Europe to dark ages. But actually on medicine, we were quite complimentary, that actually in devices and in diagnostics, I think we've beaten the States in coming up with a regime that's worked really well. I would like us, I mean, we're doing this piece of work in the context of the Prime Minister's groundbreaking commitment to set out to renegotiate our the basis of our membership and review of competencies. And my argument is this is such an important agenda for Britain, hence my comments about a new model of growth, that we can't really compromise it. We should actively engage with Europe and try and get the provisions to be as progressive as our vision. But if we can't, then we should look to derogate, which I think would be a far, far worse outcome. It absolutely shouldn't be our preferred outcome. But if the European Union decides to go down a very big government protectionist and very kind of anti-commercial partner engagement model in patient data, I think it would be a disaster for all the reasons I've outlined. Second question, I think, was about whether it can be done in such a way to involve companies and carry public support. And I think it can, absolutely think it can. In fact, I know it can because I've seen it being done. But I think the key is that it's linked to clinical leadership. And there are lots of benefits that flow from that. But one of them is, and it's a really big one, actually, if we don't generate new sources of revenue for our public health sectors, now whether it's the NHS or other models across Europe, but they all will need new sources of revenue to tackle the time bomb that is the demographic epidemiological cost curve. Well, it seems to me that it's not difficult it wouldn't be difficult to carry public support if one could explain that actually if we could, here in the UK, through Genomics England, create a structure that led to huge co-investment, creating jobs and opportunities, and new medical breakthroughs, which we get at cost or discounted price for a period at least to reflect our contribution, and thereby helped us to prevent disease and to prevent the very expensive tail of treating disease rather than preventing it, and that the revenues that flow in from industry for co-investing with us can then be reapplied into doing more research and or indeed even buying the therapies that we've just helped to invent. The politician in me thinks that is a compelling proposition that I could sell on the doorsteps. And I think, and the truth is, in the NHS we have quite a cultural challenge to get people who are driven by public health as a vocational and inspiring ethos. Not all of those people think that companies have any place in this game. I rather ironically went to a breakfast entitled Health, Innovation, Health and Wealth, which is the name of the NHS's document. And somebody there from the NHS said, "Mr. Freeman, I don't think wealth has any part to play in health." And I said, "Well, that's so interesting. I don't think you can imagine a healthy population that isn't wealthy, and you couldn't imagine a wealthy population that wasn't healthy. I think the two are fundamentally integrated in a modern economy." So I think provided one roots this within a trusted public health framework with clinicians empowered, and then the work that I did before I came to Parliament was working with individual universities and clinicians to create translational sort of special purpose vehicles that pool data, biomarkers, clinical resource, has a research committee, brings in industry to work with the research panel, and the revenues flow back and are maintained within the institute. That's a very compelling proposition for bringing in new revenues to universities, new revenues to the NHS, and building patient confidence and trust. The problem is we haven't created the structures in the NHS that actually empower clinical leaders to control academic and clinical resource. And Americans come and they say, "How on earth can you do this revolution here when you don't?" And to your last point, yes, we're absolutely open for business collaborating. I think one of the reasons why the European data protection draft provisions are so damaging is that they would undermine the enormous potential of pan-European collaborations. I mean, if we're excited by putting the data sets of London and the Midlands together and the northern conurbations, I mean, imagine a pan-European data set. And actually, in terms of global biomedicine, that's a huge opportunity for Europe. So, I mean, it would make me weep to think that the European Union would put in place provisions that would undermine that and lead to this revolution going to Palo Alto or Shanghai?
I mean, one of the problems with this issue of that people will gladly give their data for medical research, but over the decades, people care about privacy, but they will relinquish privacy for about anything: convenience, health, safety, you name it. And therefore a lot of the privacy law and data protection people will just not trust people to make the right judgment. They'll sign their internet service provider form that, yes, I want to use this service, you can use my data, that kind of. So somehow you're going to have to clearly distinguish the National Health Service rights for this from health apps and all the other. That's going to be really the challenge, is to make this so distinctive that somehow they really know that this is not just another tick box that they.
NHS is going into health apps too.
Yeah.
Well, yes. So it'll make it even more difficult to distinguish or say what are they doing. Anyway, that will.
Well, I think there is a real challenge, and part of the thing that keeps me awake at night is that if we don't embrace this, and if we don't plug this into the DNA of the NHS, and make the NHS a sort of cathedral for, or a hotel for innovation to flourish inside it, a sort of trusted forum in which innovation can flourish, then I think the danger, the sort of Armageddon scenario, is that the NHS becomes an increasingly old-fashioned and unprogressive healthcare provider that increasingly those who take their health seriously increasingly opt out of, which would be an absolute disaster for all sorts of reasons. So I think there's a real challenge. Those of us who love the NHS and can see its potential have to help it embrace this agenda. The worst thing of all would be if the NHS became seen as somewhere that wasn't open to innovation and to this, and then people take it all off stream, and you see that actually driving a privatisation of healthcare and people taking it all offline, and the NHS becomes a residual rump body doing old-fashioned medicine. That would be an absolute disaster.
Yeah, I've got a specific question about informed consent and the return of research results. You're talking about a picture which I completely agree with, and I agree with the idea of contractually focusing the relationship now between patients and clinicians. I think it's time for that, and also Roger Brownsword is involved in this, but also I'm sure you've talked to him about that. In terms of feedback, if you're having a legally binding relationship between, say, the clinician and the patient when they contract to being a participant in the research, what provisions will be in place for them to say, I don't want to know any results that come about in the process of the research, and equally, I do want to know. And if something really, crucial to their health was to arise in the process of research using their data, how would you relate that information back to them, given they would probably have a legal argument and entitlement to that information?
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question. Not least, look at prostate cancer. One of the challenges in prostate cancer is there's been a wave of earlier diagnosis, and there's been a wave of the survival rates have dramatically improved, which is a great thing. But one of the costs of that has been a lot of earlier surgical intervention to treat prostate cancer, which in fact was never going to be the thing that in the end really changed the patient's quality of life, or indeed even ultimately killed them. And the way science is going, it won't be very long before we're able to look at somebody's prostate biopsy and go, yeah, you have got early prostate cancer, but you're 76 and you've also got late stage heart disease, dementia, stroke, high blood pressure, and really those are the things we should be worrying about. And we ought to be able to build a system that's subtle enough for the patient to go, if it's not the thing that is going to be the major determinant of my life chances, please don't bother me with it. But if it is, please do. And I think this is a good thing. I think it allows patients to, and then, we have to speak to our partners and loved ones and parents and say, well, do I want to know this? Would you like to know this? Mum, if I was diagnosed, or more likely son, if I was diagnosed with dementia, do I want to know that? Do I want you to know that? I think these are the conversations that we ought to be having. So one of the reasons I like the model of sort of citizen consent is, of course, it's challenging, and it'll drive all sorts of awkward conversations over the cornflakes that we'd probably rather not have. But you know what? I think they're conversations we do need to have, because ultimately they will drive, apparently I've got the gene. Oh, well, I wish I'd known that when I started smoking aged, or didn't give up age 30, and if I've got the gene, maybe my children will have it, and maybe I could then make sure that they don't suffer. We'll make an earlier intervention, and I think it drives health awareness in a really profoundly good way. And to the insurance point, I mean, I'm not an expert on insurance. We don't have a sort of insurance-based model here, although we do have a health insurance sector. But I can well imagine that with well thought through legislative interventions, it ought to be perfectly possible to make that a benign force as well. And I'm not qualified to speculate on what they might be, or to even suggest or propose. But, maybe if one said, look, it's perfectly legitimate for insurance companies to take an interest in this. And in fact, there is an argument in dementia to say that actually it's probably an insurance model that may well be contribute to unlocking the resource to try and empower patients to delay onset. But a simple legislative, maybe there's a law required to say it is illegal to use that data to in any way change the basis on which you make available insurance. I mean, one of the joys of democracy is we can decide what it is, what is the public ill that we want to prevent, and be very clear about it. And I think a progressive legislature, that's what it's there to do. It needs to be careful not to do it in such a way as to kind of, kill the goose that lays the golden egg. But I think it's perfectly possible to imagine that as this field unfolds, an enlightened legislature can anticipate the requirements and for regulation that the public can trust.
Can I just ask, so you are envisaging legislation? That's kind of an assumption. New drafted legislation to...
I think it's impossible to imagine over the next, certainly decade, and probably more quickly than that. I think it's impossible to imagine that, given the pace at which this is unfolding, that there won't be some need for some sort of legislation. Which isn't to say that there's a bill drafted and I've seen it, or there's any discussions going on. I don't believe there are. But given the pace at which this is coming, I think it's unimaginable that there won't be.
I just wanted to get back to the points on patient trust that you raised. I thought this was very interesting, and I was doing some research on this 2 years ago, specifically also on the points that you raised, whether basically it's medical or non-medical providers, or public or private providers that provide the electronic health record. And one of the findings in this research was that for public providers, actually the patients worry less about data being misused or against their consent or whatever, but they're more worried about data being leaked, or basically being lost or whatever. So what is the government doing to improve that point on patient trust, or what would you suggest?
Well, it's a very good point. So I think there's two ways to come at this. The first is that those pioneering clinical scientists that I mentioned earlier on, refer to Professor Loveton again, he's one of a number. There's a group around the country. They're managing to do this at the moment very successfully. Professor Charlie Craddock at Birmingham, who's pioneering oncology clinical scientist, who's managed to get patients enrolled into trials and get access to drugs ethically and with consent within the NHS and set up the Institute for Translational Medicine in Birmingham. It's extraordinary. I mean, he's streets ahead of the rest of the NHS. And interestingly, Birmingham is pioneering in electronic patient records as well. It's sort of not a coincidence. So those people are doing it very well. So we wouldn't do badly to start by looking at how do they do it and how do they carry and build the trust in their cohorts, in their communities. But I think if we're going to make this happen more broadly across the system, the key is, I think, to try and build a structure where the public can understand and be reassured that the involvement of companies isn't actually the thing that they need to worry about. What they need to worry about is, firstly, whether the data that they've contracted to be used for anonymised purposes for research is only being used for that, and they've got redress in the courts, and they can go to bed at night safe and in the knowledge that that's the case. But that any revenues that flow, that any commercial gain that flows to the company through having been involved is reflected in some contract with the NHS that they can also have faith in. And this was my work before coming to Parliament for 6 years. I was working with hospital universities and putting together industry partnerships. And a translational model of research collaboration, you take a research committee, an academic, I'll give you an example. I worked with University College London, and we set up an institute for cardiovascular science, 23 professors, 400 researchers, fully funded by research charities, British Heart Foundation and others. No research strategy, no central committee, no organisation, all competing against each other, classic British university model. By setting up the research committee, you can then organise what the research is going on across the campus better. If all the bodies, the hospitals and the university, pool their intellectual property, know-how, biomarkers, databases into a pot and appoint somebody collectively to go and work with industry and bring in research collaboration funding, and that money comes into the institute and pays for informatics, studies, infrastructure, research infrastructure, multidisciplinary infrastructure. And the contracts are put in place between the UCL, North Central London, NHS, cardiovascular group and industry partner A, B or C. Then as the revenues flow in from successful commercialisation, that money comes back into an NHS research organisation. I think that's a very compelling structure because it also creates an incentive on clinicians to work with industry, but to work with them in a way that is for the good of public health care in that area. And I think that's very reassuring for patients to know that this isn't, my data is going to one company who I'll never see again. It's part of an institutional recycling of expertise and insight for the benefit of health here. And that's why I think the NHS has got to embrace this agenda and build those structures of trust that will carry public confidence. And this is coming, by the way, to your point, on Genomics England. Flagship project, £100 million, Prime Minister's launched it, we have to get it right, we're going to sequence the genome of 100,000 patients, and Sally Davis, the Chief Medical Officer, right now is working on, there are work streams working on what the ethical provisions and regulations will be for carrying patient support. There are draft papers literally sort of now in the Department of Health being consulted on with leading clinicians who are going to be working in the field. One of the challenges is we don't really have a very strong patient voice. We don't really have the forum for getting the patient voice at top table. And traditionally, clinicians have spoken for their patients, which is wholly appropriate. But I think that's changing as well. I think increasingly patients, as well as trusting their clinicians, want to have a voice at the table. And that's one of the reforms we're going to have to embrace. But the Genomics England we're breaking new ground on this, and if we get it right, I think it'll accelerate this field. If we get it wrong, I think it'll put it back several years.
If I could just add to this, during a previous government, I was involved in a small group where we were looking at these data breaches and losses of data and so forth. And one of the issues was that it's a symptom of a transition in government departments from silos to sharing data. I mean, for decades, they basically protected data by siloing departments and functions. And as they've been told to share data, to integrate data across departments, it will take more decades for them to develop the practices, just the organizational practices to know how to do that effectively without. So all of these are just symptoms of real organizational change in how, and this is not just in medical, in fact, mainly other cross-government, this is.
I should, while you ask the question, it prompted me to share a story with you, which kind of, in my journey, it has been sort of various penny dropping moments where the clank of the penny hitting the bucket. One was going around the GSK facility in Stevenage and seeing the sort of robotic, automised 96,000 automated well tray, sort of post-war Fordist model of bond set drug discovery. There was no one in there. I mean, let alone patients. There was no one in there. There was a post-it note on the fume hood that said, will someone flick it at 2 o'clock? And I thought, we're never going to discover medicines like this. But the story I want to tell you is I worked at UCL with Professor Ian Jacobs, who was the head of the UCL Academic Health Science Centre. And as we were putting together the plan for bringing industry in and working across UCL on this model, he said to me, could I have a conversation with you? Because I've got a database here in the department of women's health, and he's an ovarian cancer specialist. It's called the UK CTOX database. It's 20 years of academic work. It was funded by the MRC, CRUK, and UCL and various others. It's the world's biggest study of women at risk of ovarian cancer, 250,000 women. And it's got DNA, blood, it's got all the tissues, all the records that one would ever want. And he said it's an academic study, it's now finished. And it's starting to gather dust on the shelf. Do you think there's anything we could do with it? And he said, more depressingly than all, he said, I've been to see the technology transfer office and they tell me it's not valuable, it's not a discovery. This is a real problem actually, because across the universities we've sort of built a structure of commercialization that's very predicated on the discovery, the eureka moment. In fact, in translational medicine, it's all about the aggregation of different insights into data sets. There is no discovery moment, there's a collation. And to cut a very long story short, my team and I, working with Ian, put together a business plan for this study to be put into a vehicle owned by the bodies who'd funded it, MRC and CRUK and UCL, and the hospital. And what we developed was a business plan that acknowledged that actually women at risk of ovarian cancer are women at risk of all the classic diseases of aging. So what we have here is an extraordinary rich library of biomarkers, and we've got the ability to track those patients' life cycles going forward. So you've got the ability to look and say, quite extraordinary, 99% of women with that genetic sequence or that clinical history or that combination went on to develop dementia. That suggests that there's something in there that we should be looking at to look at the causal trigger for dementia, or whatever it may be. And so the working title for the company was the Aging Biomarker Company, because it is actually a library of biomarkers for all the diseases of aging and the onset of disease, which is the most interesting and valuable bit of all. So its working title was ABC, the Aging Biomarker Company, and it's now called Abcodia, and it's up and running, and they've raised, I have no, I should declare an interest. They didn't pay me for my 2 years' work on it, and when the company was set up, in lieu of fees not taken, I was given a very, very small shareholding. So I declare an interest. I have about 0.5% shareholding. But the point is, and here is my point, that company its core shareholders are the Medical Research Council and UCL and CRUK. And I think it's a company we should all be very proud of. And the women at the Institute for Women's Health were delighted that data was being used to develop a whole range of new biomarkers that'll help prevent disease going forwards. And I think there's an opportunity for more of that to go on. And I'd go so far as to say, actually, that would be a rather good thing for the pharmaceutical industry to be re-legitimised, in fact, through showing patient groups that it is actually at the coalface of doing work with and for them and around them to help disease. That's a much more compelling proposition for industry than what I started with, that model of $1.5 billion in 15 years, and we'll come back to you with a blockbuster. This is, we'll live it with you, we'll work with you, we'll embed in the hospital and the university with your clinician, and we'll live the difficulty of finding a solution with you. And I think that's a better place for them to be as well.
Dennis, did you have anything to ask, or if there's maybe one last question? Yes.
It could be, because I realise we're close to the witching hour.
Yes.
Yes. The concern I have is perhaps best expressed by wondering, amongst the risks that there might be, whether the gap between, the knowledge gap between genomics and clinical data may be too large for us. Sure, we're going to find the ability to get correlations, do GWAS type work, and we're going to get biomarkers. I'm sure that's all going to be very valuable. This is not a criticism of doing it.
Yeah.
We're going, though, to also wish to find mechanism as well. Now, sometimes one can get, as you were hinting earlier, mechanism from correlation, just sort of looking at it, saying, well, it looks as though there something we need to look at. And I suppose the worry I have is simply that the number of steps between genomic data and clinical outcome is just so large.
Yeah.
And our knowledge, I suppose here I'm appealing for a certain amount of humility on the part of the scientists, including myself, I'm a scientist.
What's your field?
That about how much we really know about all of those connections and steps between the genomic level and the clinical level. We don't want to give the impression, it seems to me, that we know so much that we could readily connect the data up here with the data down there. And this is just there for a warning, isn't it? It's saying, let's be a little bit careful about going over the top.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm old enough now to have lived through, I think, 3 false dawns of genomics. There was the 1990s, genomics is coming, it'll all be sorted, and everyone piled in and invested in genomics tool companies. And then there was the, no, it's not genomics, it's phenogenomics, and there's a whole wave of, and the truth is, it's actually about patients and how they get disease and how disease takes hold in different patient groups. And that's why I've sort of tried to contextualize all the genomics tonight within the context of very patient-centered research. And I'd go so far as to say, that I think it's very unlikely that we're going to find across the board simple interventions that flow from a genetic observation. But I think there's no doubt equally on the other end of the scale that genomic observations are going to become increasingly part of identifying the natural cohorts for earlier diagnosis and for developing treatment.
I think merely the fact that you used the phrase false dawn reassures me.
Very good. Well, maybe we thank you. Really, really very good.